Picture this, it's 1925, and you're at the beach on a hot summer day. You're wearing a bathing suit that shows your knees. Suddenly, a police officer approaches with a measuring tape. He kneels down and measures the distance from your knee to the hem of your suit. It's 7 inches. 1 inch too much. You're arrested for indecent exposure. This happened to thousands of women across America. But they didn't stop. They kept returning to the beach, and eventually the measuring tapes disappeared. Before we uncover this story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories like this to light. Now let's dive in together and discover how this bathing suit ban was born, why police measured women's legs on beaches, and how ordinary women brought this absurd law crashing down. The Bathing Suit Wars, How Police Measured Women's Legs on American Beaches, Atlantic City, New Jersey, 1922. The summer sun beat down on the crowded beach. Families spread blankets on the sand. Children ran toward the waves, shrieking with delight. The smell of salt water mixed with the scent of hot dogs and popcorn from the boardwalk vendors, it should have been a scene of pure leisure and joy. But along the beach, a different kind of activity was taking place. Police officers in dark uniforms walked slowly across the sand, their eyes scanning the crowds. They were not looking for thieves or troublemakers. They were looking for women whose bathing suits violated the law. The bathing suit laws of the 1920s were among the most absurd regulations ever imposed on American beaches. Cities across the country passed ordinances dictating exactly what women could and could not wear in the water. The rules were incredibly specific. Bathing suits had to cover a certain amount of leg, measured from the knee. In some cities, the limit was 6 inches above the knee. In others, it was 4. Sleeveless suits were banned in certain locations. Suits that clung too tightly to the body were considered indecent. And enforcement was not theoretical. It was real, intrusive, and humiliating. Beach patrols were established specifically to measure women's swimsuits. Officers carried tape measures and rulers. They approached women on the sand, ordered them to stand and measured the distance from the hem of their suit to their knee. If the measurement exceeded the legal limit, the woman was issued a citation. In some cases, she was arrested on the spot, led off the beach in handcuffs, while beachgoers stared. Photographs of these arrests were published in newspapers as warnings to other women who might consider defying decency standards. The justification for these laws was the same tired argument that had been used to control women for centuries. Religious groups and conservative politicians argued that revealing bathing suits corrupted public decency and led to immoral behavior. They claimed that exposed legs tempted men and undermined family values. Doctors added pseudoscientific claims, suggesting that too much sun exposure on bare skin was harmful to women's health. But the real issue, as always, was control. Women were gaining more freedom in the 1920s, voting, working, driving cars, cutting their hair short, wearing makeup. The bathing suit laws were an attempt to push back against that freedom. The 1920s marked a turning point in women's fashion and autonomy. The decade is often remembered for flappers, jazz, and pro-bagin. But it was also a time when women began challenging long-held restrictions on their bodies and behavior. Bathing suits became a flashpoint in this cultural war. Earlier swimwear had been almost comically restrictive, heavy wool dresses that covered women from neck to ankle, worn with stockings and shoes. These outfits were not designed for swimming. They were designed to preserve modesty, even at the cost of comfort, safety, and common sense. But by the 1920s, women were demanding practical swimwear. They wanted to actually swim, not just wade timidly in shallow water while their heavy skirts dragged them down. Swimsuit manufacturers began producing lighter, more form-fitting designs. Suits became shorter, sleeveless, and made of materials that dried quickly. Women embraced these changes enthusiastically. For the first time, they could move freely in the water. They could dive, swim, and play without being weighed down by layers of fabric. Authorities were horrified. The new bathing suits, they declared, were scandalous. Women were exposing their arms, their legs, their bodies in ways that were previously unthinkable. Something had to be done. And so, the bathing suit laws were born. Enforcement varied by location, but some cities took it more seriously than others. Atlantic City, a popular beach resort, became infamous for its aggressive beach patrols. Chicago hired special morality officers whose sole job was to monitor swimwear compliance. In Los Angeles, lifeguards were instructed to report women wearing illegal suits. The penalties ranged from fines to arrest to being banned from the beach entirely. It was in this environment of surveillance and control that a young woman named Louise Bennett decided she had had enough. Louise was 23 years old in the summer of 1924. She lived in Atlantic City and worked as a secretary at a hotel on the boardwalk. She loved the ocean. On her days off, she would go to the beach early in the morning before the crowds arrived and swim as far out as she dared. Swimming made her feel strong, capable, and free in a way that nothing else did. Louise owned 2 bathing suits. One was an older, longer suit that complied with the city's regulations. It was heavy, uncomfortable, and made swimming difficult. The other was a newer suit she had purchased from a shop in Philadelphia. It was sleeveless, made of lightweight knit fabric, and ended about 7 inches above her knee, 1 inch over the legal limit. She had bought it specifically because it allowed her to swim properly. She knew it violated the law, but she reasoned that if she went to the beach early, before the patrols started, she could avoid trouble. For several weeks, Louise's strategy worked. She arrived at the beach at dawn, swam for an hour and left before the crowds and the police appeared. But one Saturday morning in August, she stayed a little too long. The sun was higher than usual. The beach was starting to fill with families, and a beach patrol officer was making his rounds. The officer's name was Donald Pritchard. He was in his mid-30s, a former military man who took his job very seriously. He believed that enforcing morality laws was a sacred duty, that he was protecting society from degeneracy. When he saw Louise walking out of the water in her short, form-fitting suit, he did not hesitate. Pritchard approached Louise as she was drying off with a towel. He informed her that her bathing suit appeared to violate city ordinances and that he needed to measure it. Louise felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. She told him she was leaving and that there was no need for a measurement. Pritchard insisted. He pulled a tape measure from his belt and ordered her to stand still. Louise stood frozen as the officer knelt in the sand and measured the distance from her knee to the hem of her suit, 7 inches. He wrote the measurement in his notebook, then informed her that she was in violation of municipal code and would need to accompany him to the station. Louise protested. She said she had done nothing wrong, that she was simply swimming. Pritchard was unmoved. He said the law was the law. Louise was escorted off the beach in full view of dozens of beachgoers. Some people stared. Others whispered. A few women looked at her with sympathy, recognizing that they could just as easily be in her position. Louise was taken to the police station, where she was booked, fingerprinted, and held for several hours before being released with a citation. She was ordered to appear in court the following week. The humiliation was overwhelming. Louise had never been in trouble with the law. She had never imagined that wearing a bathing suit could result in arrest. But more than humiliation, she felt anger. Anger at the absurdity of the law. Anger at the invasion of her privacy. Anger at a system that treated women's bodies as public property to be measured, judged, and controlled. When Louise appeared in court, the courtroom was packed. News of her arrest had spread, and journalists were present. Eager to cover the story, the prosecutor argued that Louise had knowingly violated decency laws and that such violations undermined public morality. He presented the tape measure as evidence. He called Officer Pritchard to testify about the measurement he had taken. Louise's defense was simple. She said she had been swimming, not causing a disturbance. She argued that her bathing suit was no different from those worn by thousands of other women across the country. She pointed out that men wore far less clothing on the beach and faced no legal consequences. The judge was unimpressed. He found her guilty and imposed a fine of $10, a significant sum for a working woman in 1924. But the judge also issued a warning. He said that if more women continued to defy bathing suit laws, the city would be forced to impose stricter penalties. He suggested that women who wanted to swim should do so in private pools where their immodesty would not offend public decency. Louise paid the fine, but she did not stop going to the beach. and she did not stop wearing her shorter bathing suit. She returned the following weekend, and the weekend after that, she was cited again, fined again. But she kept coming back. Word of Louise's persistence spread. Other women began wearing shorter suits to the beach, inspired by her refusal to comply. Some were fined, some were arrested. But the numbers grew. What had started as a few isolated violations became a wave of defiance. The beach patrols found themselves overwhelmed. Officers could not possibly measure every woman on a crowded beach. The courts were clogged with bathing suit cases. Judges grew tired of presiding over trials about hemlines. Newspapers began publishing editorials questioning whether police resources should really be devoted to measuring swimsuits when actual crimes were being committed. Public opinion was shifting. Many people, especially younger Americans, saw the bathing suit laws as outdated and ridiculous. They pointed out that women in Europe wore far more revealing swimwear without society collapsing. They argued that women had the right to choose their own clothing without government interference. Even some religious leaders began to suggest that the laws were doing more harm than good, driving people away from the beach rather than protecting morality. The swimsuit industry also played a role. Manufacturers recognized that women wanted practical, comfortable swimwear, and they began mass-producing shorter, sleeker designs. These suits became wildly popular. Department stores sold them by the thousands. Trying to enforce laws against them became logistically impossible. By 1926, enforcement of bathing suit laws was becoming sporadic. Some cities quietly stopped issuing citations. Others left the laws on the books but instructed officers to focus on more serious matters. The cultural tide had turned and the authorities knew it. But the final blow to bathing suit laws came from an unexpected source: beauty pageants. In 1921, Atlantic City had launched the first Miss America pageant as a way to extend the summer tourist season. Contestants wore bathing suits as part of the competition. The pageant was hugely popular, drawing crowds and media attention from across the country. But there was an obvious problem. The bathing suits worn by pageant contestants often violated the very laws that Atlantic City was trying to enforce. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. The city was arresting ordinary women for wearing suits similar to those celebrated in its own pageant. Critics pointed out the hypocrisy. How could a city claim that short bathing suits were immoral while simultaneously hosting a contest that showcased them? The pageant organizers and city officials scrambled to justify the difference, but their explanations were unconvincing. By the late 1920s, bathing suit laws were effectively dead. They remained on the books in some cities for years, even decades, but enforcement had ceased. Women wore what they wanted to the beach. The measuring tapes disappeared. The beach patrols moved on to other duties, and the absurd spectacle of police officers kneeling in the sand to measure women's legs became a relic of a more restrictive era. Louise Bennett continued to swim in Atlantic City for the rest of her life. She never became famous. Her name does not appear in history books, but she was part of a movement, a collective refusal by women to accept rules that made no sense. Every time she walked onto the beach in her short bathing suit, she was making a statement that her body belonged to her, not to the state, not to the church, not to the men who believed they had the right to regulate it. The bathing suit wars were never just about swimwear. They were about autonomy, freedom, and the right to move through the world without constant surveillance and judgment. They were about women refusing to be shamed for their bodies, for enjoying themselves, for participating in public life on their own terms. Today, the idea that police once measured women's bathing suits seems laughable, but it happened. It was real. Women were arrested, fined, and publicly humiliated for showing their knees, and they fought back, not with grand protests or dramatic speeches, but by simply refusing to comply. They kept wearing the suits they wanted to wear. They kept going to the beach. They kept swimming, and eventually, the law had no choice but to give up. The legacy of the bathing suit wars is visible every summer on beaches around the world. Women swim in whatever they find comfortable. They dive, surf, play volleyball, and sunbathe without fear of being measured or arrested. That freedom was not granted. It was won, inch by women like Louise Bennett, who decided that enough was enough. The bathing suit laws are a reminder that oppression often hides behind the language of morality and decency. The authorities claimed they were protecting women and preserving social order. In reality, they were trying to control women's bodies and limit their freedom. And they failed, not because the laws were repealed by enlightened leaders, but because ordinary women refused to obey them. Louise Bennett never regretted being arrested. Years later, she would tell friends that it was one of the most important moments of her life. It taught her that unjust laws only have power if people comply with them. And it showed her that even small acts of resistance, wearing a bathing suit that was 1 inch too short, could contribute to larger change. The measuring tapes are gone. The beach patrols are gone. The absurd laws are gone. But the lesson remains: freedom is not given. It is taken one act of defiance at a time. The bathing suit laws are long gone, but the pattern is still familiar. Throughout history, authorities have used morality and decency as excuses to control women's bodies and choices. It makes you wonder what rules exist today that future generations will look back on with disbelief. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments, what modern restriction do you think will seem absurd in 100 years? And if you want to uncover more forgotten stories of ordinary people who refuse to accept unjust rules, subscribe to the channel. History is full of women like Louise Bennett, people who changed the world simply by refusing to comply. Let's keep discovering their stories together.